So, hello, I'm Molly Fuller, and this guy over here
Where?
is Robert Miltner. So, we're getting ready to do an interview about Raymond Carver. You have, like, weird things in your glasses.
It's that thing.
We're going to have to fix that.
It's that thing, yeah.
And we realized that it was 7 p.m.
Moon time.
Moon time, middle of the United States time.
We don't do time zones in poetry. We just don't.
Clearly.
It's timeless. It's immemorial. Time immemorial.
So we have an hour, and I thought, what would be more fun than recording Robert getting super excited about something. Like, I was going to start a series called Robert Gets Excited about ... So,
The ellipsis?
well, just anything. You probably could get excited about punctuation.
Exactly.
I could see it. So I think I'm just going to ask Robert some questions. And
Can I ask you some questions then?
yeah, you can ask me some questions. You can ask first. What do you want to ask me? Oh, my friend's texting me. She did the Raymond Carver homework and she's ready. See? She must have known that it starts at 8 and not 7 p.m.
Was there homework? Nobody told me.
Well, you have to read the stories
Oh, yes, I see. Yes,
to discuss
yes,
them.
Yes.
I mean, but I've never read anything by Raymond Carver, actually.
I've actually got, when we
Just
talk
kidding.
about love, tattooed across my back.
He does not.
Whole story.
He doesn't. Here,
He's
I have
a
a
minimalist.
question.
You can do it.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So, what is the very first story that you remember reading and thinking, or even a poem, like, very first thing that you read and you thought, I want to be a writer.
Oh.
I want to do that.
Wow.
I know mine.
Maybe Poe.
Really, Poe?
Maybe Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay, I can see that.
I think that there was something about Poe that he was the first writer I ever thought about the person behind the piece.
Okay.
And maybe it's because his work has such an appeal to that age group of like late adolescence where we become kind of fascinated with things that are jarring or disturbing, or watching somebody being walled up, or the Pit and the Pendulum. There was a thing about that he put me into those pieces in ways I never understood that, and I thought, this isn't for entertainment purposes here. We're doing something different. Yeah. Poe. And you?
Well, I was in 6th grade, which was like last year.
No, it was 2 years ago. Be honest.
Okay, 2 years ago.
Held her back a lot. A long time.
So 6th grade, and we read A Wrinkle in Time.
Oh, yes.
By Madeline Allingham.
Yes.
And I remember reading that book
Mm-hmm.
and just being like fascinated by her ability to create this completely different world. I mean, it's like such an imaginative world in that book. And I remember thinking, I want to be a writer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I probably dabbled before that, like, but I mean, that's like a point I actually remember.
Yeah, well, maybe it's in adolescence where, in our childhood, we know the world we know is our family, and in adolescence, we know there's a larger world, and we begin to encounter that larger world. And if we and writers like Poe and L'Engle, who invent worlds.
Yes.
Because I'm thinking too how
you're right.
Around the time I was reading Poe, I think Poe maybe led me to maybe like Jules Verne, who was doing fantastic, Journey to the Center of the Earth, or traveling across landscapes in hot air balloons, or being in submarines. Those perspectives were just nothing I could have imagined on my own at that age. But like, he took me to those places. Yeah. So maybe that's what it is. It seems to me there's a commonality with both of us here, at least on this initial level, that we were attracted to writers who could invent places, imaginary places, interesting enough that we wanted to enter those places, and we liked those places. There was something about them that pulled us and kept us, and when we left the story, those stories didn't leave us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, I'm trying to think of when I read Tolkien, because it might have been around that time. It was sixth grade, and I, discovered science fiction and just started reading all the science fiction. Spent a lot of time in the library, just like going down the science fiction aisle and like.
Oh yeah.
Just I'm a voracious reader, and I'm a very fast reader. I can read really quickly, especially texts that aren't dense. Like I wouldn't say that I could read, critical theory very quickly.
Quantum physics. Yeah.
But fiction and poetry, I'm very fast, and you know that. You do. You are really fast. I'll pick up a book and I'll be done in a couple hours or like a day.
Yeah. You're a really rapid reader. Something else you just said there that's interesting too, and it has to do with science fiction, because that again is being drawn to those imaginary worlds in life. I was kind of my access to books were the few books my mother had in the house. The public library and my elementary school, the library was a closet, and the woman who ran the lunch thing the nuns would line us up, and she would lean over and she'd go, and she'd hand a book and go, read this.
There's so many jokes I want to make about.
You can have them.
You being in the closet and come out with your books.
Well, yeah, but see, so here's the thing then that's interesting about it. So when I went to public junior high school, they had a large library there, and you could sign out of study hall and just go there. And I'm going, you can just spend time in school just reading books. And I remember going in the library and finding the science fiction long shelf of science fiction.
Yes, the big long shelf, all the opportunities, all the worlds.
Mm-hmm. And in that year, that was a 9 months year long of school, I started with Isaac Asimov, and I finished somewhere around Kurt Vonnegut.
Nice.
And when I got to Vonnegut at the end, I remember thinking, this isn't like that other science fiction at all.
Right.
He was inventing fantasy worlds and worlds of satire and play that were just so different. And it was like a whole level. It was like literary science fiction. It wasn't just for entertainment purposes, but it was for opening us up from the familiar into something unfamiliar that we became familiar with. Yeah, that crazy stuff Vonnegut was doing. Sirens of Titan,
I'm trying to think of who. Le Guin.
Oh yeah.
She was another one. That I was, while you were talking, I was trying to remember. I wasn't actually listening to you when you were talking.
So what else is new?
Just kidding. I was listening, but I was also trying to remember my other favorites. And I was thinking, Anne McCaffrey. I love Anne McCaffrey.
Oh yeah, you still read her.
I do. She's my go-to comfort book. When you need that comforty book that.
Yeah. Like Watership Down.
Oh yeah.
Which is another transportation. Yes. Beast Fables. I was always a little fascinated with those. Yeah. Period. Full stop. Your turn. There was a rabbit hole, literally. I didn't want to go down there.
A rabbit hole. So that was kind of the first thing I read that I remember thinking, wow, I want to be a writer, like,
oh yeah,
like that sort of like, just to create that kind of feeling in people, like, like I don't, I'm trying to even remember, if I ever. I'm trying to remember the first reading I went to. Like, first reader I ever saw. Can't even. I'd have to really think about that.
Oh, I can tell you. First reader I ever saw. I saw these two people in the same week. Maybe it was a couple weeks apart. The first person real live reader I ever saw read was Nikki Giovanni.
Wow.
Her first chapbook was out.
I thought that would have been amazing.
Oh, and she was at Xavier, and they brought her out on stage, and she had these two guys. They were probably Black Panthers, or they had the black coats and the hats and the folded arms, and she's very short, and her stage presence and her delivery was something like nothing I'd ever heard before. I think I'd listened to records of people reading, and they were usually like Auden and the English poets who recorded. And shortly after that, I saw Allen Ginsberg. Those were like the first two readings I saw. And Ginsberg was reading at Case Western. And I drove out there with some friends. And he came out and he was doing the little bells and chanting. And he's playing his little organ. It's that little pump organ that he had. Don't go there. You're so bad. But that was part of what he was doing, because he was doing, to him, he also introduced me to the idea in that moment that poetry could be a chant. It was to incantation.
Yeah, incantation.
And Nikki Giovanni was not reading like anybody else I'd ever read. She was reading poetry in a very normal voice, and she read it with prose cadence.
Okay.
And it was just so... Those experiences were huge for me. I didn't ever, when I was young, think about writing stories or novels, though. It never worked for me.
Really? Like you always wanted to do poetry?
I didn't even think about that very much. No, I didn't really think about writing until I was probably 15 and started playing guitar and started being in bands. And I suddenly was paying really close attention to these lyrics, and I wanted to write song lyrics, because at my age, at my interest level, that was where I wanted to come into it, because I knew that playing a guitar gave me a whole new voice, and I wanted to carry that over and to put words into that. I was terrible at it, but that's not the point, okay? Because what I was actually doing, because that took me... I went through that doorway, and I kind of went right through the music room, and suddenly I was in the poetry room, and then that was the doorway that brought me into poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
I wrote short stories in 6th grade. I remember. And
I bet you did.
The title was "Ghostly Goings-Ons." That's all I remember about the title. So good.
Go on. That wasn't your title. Go
Come on. That was so good. Just the alliteration.
The alliteration,
right?
Yeah.
So good. I don't really remember the ghost or what was going on per se. And then when I was in high school, I, of course, wrote shitty poetry because it's high school, right? And you're like heartbroken and trying to get your feelings out. And
well, but that's healthy. That's if you're a writer, and whether you're a diarist or a poet of sorts, it's trying to articulate feelings, and even though at that age we tend to draw from, like we read metaphors, we come to understand metaphors, and so the relationship of the poet and the moon is like, we know there's something going on there, but we can't articulate it, and we know that these emotions we're having they're not simple, they're complex, and we know that, but our language for talking about them is still very literal and very early analogy, and we don't have a vocabulary yet for that, and so we borrow. And I looked back. I think of some of the first poems I wrote, and I'm like, where were the matches right after that?
That's
but they again were that was the doorway I came through for writing.
Right.
And those early pieces were how I was able to articulate things, and for me, like I'd mentioned, the guitar was my voice. I could play my feelings, but I didn't have words for them. And so when I moved into words, I naturally went from song lyrics to lyrical poetry.
Right.
But I began to find that a really limited field, and it took me a long, long time. I even stopped writing for a while. I didn't think I had anything. I felt like I wasn't saying the things I wanted to say, and then sometimes I was away from writing for a long time, and then when I was writing again in verse poetry, I came across the prose poem, and it changed my life incredibly.
Well, I came across you, and that changed my life incredibly.
Yes, and you started writing prose poems. And you were working on novels, and I started working on novels somewhere around there too. But we grow from where we are at a place we can articulate to the next place that allows us to articulate, because when we go from poetry to a novel, for example, we can invent the whole world, or we record the world, or we document that world, or we use it as a base and we use it as realism, but we layer it and texture it. And as our understanding of something complex becomes more understood, more ingrained, we're suddenly able to write that complexity, and that's a magnificent feeling. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And now, I think it's time that we get ready for our
broken jaw.
But this was fun, and we should do it again.
We should.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.